It's been a hard week. I was back there worshiping. All you first-time guests are probably like, security. We're in Romans chapter 3 today, and Martin Luther, one of the great reformers, one of the great leaders in church history, called Romans chapter 3, the verses that we're going to look at today, some of the most important verses in the entire Bible. So if you're new with us today, if you don't understand the Bible quite as well as you'd like, you picked a great day to come. I want to ask one question and answer this question through the Apostle Paul's writing to the Romans, and it's this question: why did Jesus die? Why did Jesus have to die? I mean, what kind of God would create a system where the only way sins could be forgiven is for somebody to die? I mean, we forgive each other all the time. You sin against me, I forgive you. I sin against you, you forgive me. Why did somebody have to die for that? I mean, I think back in one of the worst moments of my lifetime in 2006 when Charles Robert IV, Lancaster County, walked into an Amish schoolhouse, tied up 10 girls aged 6 to 13 and shot them all. And the entire community, the Amish community, rallied around his family and forgave him. If humans can forgive that horrible act, why couldn't God just say, you're forgiven, I'm God, let's just move on? Why did Jesus have to die? And that's the question that Paul addresses really here in Romans chapter 3. Now, I told you that we're not going to look at every single verse in the book of Romans for time's sake only. I mean, every verse is helpful and inspired and practical, but we're going to pick up with verse 9 today as we jump into this whole question. The Apostle Paul to the church at Rome says this: we have already made the charge that Jews and Gentiles alike are all under sin. Under sin is a big deal. Now, we use terms like under the weather to essentially say I'm sick and I'm consumed by this sickness and I can't leave my house because I'm under the weather, right? Or we say my situation with my house is underwater, right? I owe more than it's worth and I'm drowning in debt. I'm underwater. Or we say under arrest, meaning I'm chained up with these orange clothes. I'm unable to get myself free. I'm under arrest. Right? It's a legal term, under sin. To be under sin, Keller writes, is a legal term. We are citizens of sin. So I used my passport to illustrate this whole principle. Took a photo of my passport. And right here, it says my nationality is the United States of America. Now, I have a lot of nationalities. I'm 25% Norwegian, 25% Belgian. I'm a few other things. You know, my ancestors came over. But legally, I'm a United States citizen. And right here, interestingly, it says authority. And my authority is the United States Department of State. That's who I have to answer to legally. But to use this as an illustration for my spiritual citizenship, I am a U.S. citizen under sin. And my authority is sin. That's who is my master. I'm locked up. I'm enslaved in sin. So legally, I'm a citizen of this nation no matter my dedication. Right? I would say I'm a fairly righteous person. You know, I only drive about 5 miles an hour over the speed limit. Every once in a while, I jaywalk, pay my taxes. But for the most part, I'm a pretty good U.S. citizen. And I would say that I'm rather patriotic. I take my kids to Boston and Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. to celebrate all the great moments of U.S. history. I dress in red, white, and blue on the 4th of July, and I celebrate the fireworks. I'm pretty patriotic, right? Now, some of you are really patriotic. Like you've served in the military, you love the United States of America. Some of you are even less patriotic than I am, but we're still citizens of the United States no matter your dedication. And in the same way, legally, I was a citizen of sin no matter my dedication to sin. No matter how much I am dedicated to sin, whether it's a lot or a little or somewhere in the middle, I am still a citizen of sin. I'm under sin. I'm enslaved to sin. That is my legal standing. So Paul wants to hit this whole idea home. And in the next part of his letter, he says, as it is written. So this is the most Old Testament passages that show up sequentially in the entire New Testament. So Paul's like, this isn't something I came up with. This has been in the Psalms. It's in Isaiah. And so he says this, as it is written, there is no one righteous, not even one. And you might be like, isn't that kind of an exaggeration? Because I know a righteous person. You know a couple righteous people. But the reality is, you've seen their highlight reels, or you've seen them when they're in their best behavior. But what are they like behind closed doors? Paul says, there's no one righteous, not even one. Let me illustrate this. Just last night, right? So not that long ago, I'm sitting in the living room of one of my friends. There's a bunch of us gathered around, right? And we're just chit-chatting, having a good time. Then all of a sudden, I get hit in the face with a basketball. And I'm like, where did that come from? I didn't see it coming. It just, and my eyes are watering, right? And I look up, and my son is up on the balcony area, and I said, did you throw that at me? Like, what just happened? And he kind of had this look of shame. He's like, well, I was spinning it on my finger, and then it just fell off and went down and hit you in the face. And I was like, I'm like trying to collect myself, right? And because there's people watching me. And I'm like, I had this nice interaction, a very calm interaction. And one of my friends said, you handled that really well. And I said, yeah, that's because I'm righteous. That's because I'm a good person. And then my other friend, who always speaks the truth, just kind of says the truth, he goes, the reason he handled it well is because there's a whole bunch of us in the room. I'm like, yeah, that's true. Because if it was just me in the room and him up there hitting me, I'd have chased him down. It would not have looked the same way, right? So I can be righteous in front of you, and I can be righteous when people are looking, and you can be righteous on social media where we see one another's highlight reels. But we're not really nearly as righteous as we think we are. There's nobody righteous, not even one. Even in our best moments, our motives are tainted, right? There's no one who understands, no one who seeks God. And you might push back and say, well, I'm here in church seeking God. That's what I'm doing. What do you mean no one seeks God? And what Paul wants to communicate here is that we don't put God at the center of our lives. That we often seek our own ambition and our own selfishness. That naturally I seek my own selfish ambitions. No one seeks God. He goes on. All have turned away. They have together become worthless. There is no one who does good, not even one. Now, I've entitled this sermon Worthless because that's a strong word. Right? I mean, to call somebody worthless would be like, whew, that's strong. Now, the Greeks would use this word worthless when they would refer to rotten fruit. Right? Like you see a plate of rotten fruit and you throw it away because it's worthless. It's not to be used for any good purposes. It's worthless. Now, spoiler alert, it's a little teaser. Sometimes rotten bananas can be redeemed to make banana bread. Amen? So it's worthless, but hold on, okay? Paul goes on, right? He's hitting home this theme that we are enslaved in sin. He says, their throats are open graves. I mean, think about this. Your heart, Jeremiah tells us, is deceitful and beyond cure. Our hearts are sick. So when you have a thought, and it comes from your heart, Proverbs 4:3 says the heart is the wellspring of life, right? It eventually goes from your heart, and then it makes itself up there in the throat, and then it comes out. Now, he says it's an open grave. In the ancient world, they would have these graves with lots of bodies inside, and then they'd roll the stone in front of it. If you rolled the stone away, you don't want to walk in front of that grave because of the decay. You're like, whew, that is just pungent. That is awful. And Paul's saying that those things that come from your heart, that deception, that selfishness, sometimes it works itself out. And it's like you're just destroying things all over the place with your words. He goes on, the poison of vipers is on their lips. Their mouths are full of cursing and bitterness. And their feet are swift to shed blood. Now, you might say, well, I haven't shed any blood anytime recently. Right? I haven't committed murder. And as we've been saying, even in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, even if you're angry with your brother, you will be judged. Right? And what is anger? Anger happens, as Keller says, because they have blocked us from access to an idol. As we said last week, there's no such thing as, or you don't have a right to be righteously angry because you're not righteous enough. You can't handle it. Only God who's righteous can become angry. And so when we get angry, it's because somebody's blocked our access to an idol. Okay, so let me give you an illustration. If you're sitting there watching TV, like maybe you're watching American Idol like I do on Sunday nights, and some kid gets in the way, and they're like standing there, and you're like, get out of the way, right? They've blocked what can become an idol. Like, I missed the touchdown, right? They've blocked an idol. In a more serious way, somebody may have blocked your access to a promotion, or they've blocked your access to financial, or they've blocked your access to be a starter on the team. And so we get angry, and we, quote, shed blood. Paul says, ruin and misery mark their ways. The way of peace, they do not know. Isn't it true that misery loves company? Like if I can invite you to my pity party, that's a better party. If I can get you to come on board with my sin and my evil ways, that's a party that I enjoy throwing, right? And then Paul says there's a reason that you do this. There's a reason that you act this way, that things come out of your mouth and thoughts come and you wreak havoc. It's because there's no fear of God before their eyes. I mean, you may have moments where you fear God, but in general, you fear man, or you fear the approval of men or the thoughts of men more than you do God. And so he says, now we know that whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law. And we established in Romans chapter 1, Paul talked about creation, how you go and you see a beautiful sunset, or you see the ocean, or an amazing, majestic scene in nature, and you say, wow, and then you walk away and you suppress the truth. Or we have the commandments, the law of Moses, the Mosaic law that we look at and we say, oh, I'm guilty. And you might say, well, what if you're blind and you can't see creation? Right? Or what if you've never been given access to the law of Moses? Paul says you're still guilty because the law has been written on your hearts. In other words, you have a conscience, and your conscience sometimes speaks to the fact that you're guilty, and your conscience sometimes rationalizes your sin. So you're under the law so that every mouth may be silenced and the whole world held accountable to God. Paul says, you're so guilty and your heart is such a mess that when Jesus comes back, you're going to sit there in your guilt and you're going to be silenced with nothing to say and no excuse. To give you an illustration of something that happened about 30 years ago, because it's always safe to give you illustrations that happened years ago. My parents had a subscription to Sports Illustrated for me, and I got home from school one day, and I opened up the Sports Illustrated. Well, the cover was ripped off, and half of the pictures were ripped out. You know where I'm going with this, and I was like, oh, man, And in the basement of my house, my dad has fixed it since then, but at the time, my basement was like hell. I mean, if it rained, you could literally almost swim in this basement. It was danky, musty, nasty, mildew. It was gross, and you didn't go down there unless you absolutely had to. So I go down the basement. I can't remember if it was that evening or a couple of days later. I'm in this nasty, horrible situation, and I see a garbage bag. And I could see through the garbage bag where all the pictures of the Sports Illustrated swimsuit issue that had been ripped out. And now I'm going through the garbage bag. And I'm leafing through all the nasty garbage, getting all kind of stuff on me and smelly, rotten, worthless stuff. And I got the pictures out and I'm looking at it. And then I got caught. And what do you do when you're caught? You're silent. I mean, I'm not going to say, well, Dad, I was looking for my Bible in the trash can because your pagan other son threw it away. So I was looking through the trash, and then I came upon this beautiful creation, and I was just admiring the goodness. I mean, no, you're silent when you're guilty. There's nothing you can say. So Paul says, no one will be declared righteous in his sight by observing the law. Rather, through the law, we become conscious of sin. You know, the primary purpose of the Old Testament scriptures is so that we read it and we say, I have fallen short. Now, if you're new to church, this whole idea of sin might be new, and you may have thought to yourself, well, I don't know if it's that serious. I'm just kind of like a mistaker, right? Like I make mistakes. Like I forget to dot my I and cross the T, and I leave food in the oven too long and I burn it. Yeah, sometimes I say some bad stuff, but I'm mostly just a mistaker. Others of you may be a little more sophisticated, and you might say, yeah, I am a sinner, right? But I'm mostly a good person who happens to sin every once in a while. And Paul says, it's deeper than that. It's stronger than that. You're actually under sin. You're arrested by sin. You're made captive to your sin. And this is such a big deal that the Apostle Paul, as I said in week 1, spent 63 verses talking about the ugly truth that is within all of us. And so I just think every once in a while, it's a good idea for us to spend some time in the dumpster thinking about our captivity to sin. Thinking about the fact that we are worthless and rotten and our hearts are deceptive. And I thought about getting back in the dumpster like I did that one time. But then I thought, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to do it with these handcuffs. And then I thought to myself, you know what? Sometimes we're so cuffed by sin, we don't even get inside the dumpster because we're so distracted by so many other things. Like in this moment right here, okay? In this moment, those of you watching online and in the room, if you are not moved by these verses, if you're not examining your life with the seriousness of sin that Paul describes, in part, it's because you're shackled by sin. And you don't even have the strength to get inside the dumpster because your sin has so shackled you and imprisoned you and blinded you and put you under the water and arrested you. But I just think it's wise every once in a while for us to pause and to think about the fact that we're under sin, that we're arrested, that we're locked up, and that we're a mess, that we're rotten. Before we get to one of the most amazing passages ever written, where Paul writes this, but now, I've read this passage like 100 times this week, and I get chills almost every time when I read it because it's so profound. But now, a righteousness from God, apart from the law, has been made known, to which the law and the prophets testify. Paul says, this isn't just something that I came up with in the moment. This has been prophesied for hundreds of years in the Old Testament. That this righteousness from God comes through faith in Christ Jesus to all who believe. The Jews, the Gentiles, those who are self-righteous, those who are big sinners, those who are little sinners, those who are medium-sized sinners, those who are super patriotic, those who are not so patriotic. For there is no difference, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. We're all in the dumpster. And I think sometimes we need to think about that. So I'm in Boston recently, and I'm standing on the shore of the ocean looking out. And I thought to myself, I wonder how far it is to the other side. And I pull out my phone, and I discovered that it was 3,211 miles to Portugal. Okay? So let's all of us after the service, let's go out to Boston. Let's stand on the shore, and let's see who can make it to Portugal. I'll tell you what's going to happen. Some of you are going to like doggy paddle for a little while, and then you're just going to be underwater. Others of us, like myself, I'm a decent swimmer. Like I can get maybe a couple hundred yards, and then I'm underwater. I'm sunk. Let's say Michael Phelps shows up, or some championship swimmer. How far can he make it? Maybe a few miles. Nowhere near the 55 days that it would take to go from Boston to Portugal. You could be great swimmer. You could be not so great of a swimmer or somewhere in between. And we're all falling short of the glory of God. We're all in the dumpster. But he goes on. This is so good. And we're justified freely by his grace through the redemption that came by Christ Jesus. We're justified. We're declared not guilty freely by his grace, God's riches at Christ's expense. This is what Jesus did, right? You're stuck in the dumpster, and he went dumpster diving, and he went down in your mess while you were worthless and said, you've got worth to me, and I'm giving everything to you so that I can pick you up and redeem you. See, did you know many of you when you drove in here, you passed two great establishments. You passed the Beartown Redemption Center, Beartown Peaches and Cream, and then you came into this driveway, which could also be called Beartown Redemption Center. Because while you were worthless, Christ dove in and grabbed you and picked you up and dusted you off and said, you're not guilty. Freely, by his grace, you've been justified. Whew. Isn't that awesome? God presented him as a sacrifice of atonement through faith in his blood. Now, what does the word atonement mean? I like to think atonement is at one-ment. The word could also be translated, as the ESV does, propitiation. Right? It's a means of appeasing because God is so holy that he demands a payment is made. He can't just wipe it underneath the carpet and say, you're forgiven, let's move on. He's a holy God who needs to have his wrath towards your sin appeased. Propitiation, a means of appeasing. And this answers the question, why did Jesus die? Why did he die? He did this to demonstrate his justice. Because justice needed to be served. Because in his forbearance or in his patience for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, he had left the sins committed beforehand unpunished. Well, you say, well, didn't they have the sacrificial system where the blood that was spilled would atone for their sins? Yes, but it was temporary. It was only partially effective. It pointed to something that was greater. When John the Baptist saw Jesus Christ, he would say, behold the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world. And it was on the scene, and when Jesus died, it became effective. And he says he did this to demonstrate his justice at the present time so as to be just and the one who justifies those who have faith in Jesus. He says, payment for sin needs to be made. And in my justice, in my holiness, the payment needs to be made. But in my grace and in my mercy, I'm the one who's going to make it. I love what Keller writes. He says, the wonder of the cross is that in the very same stroke, it satisfies both the love of God and the justice of God, because God is love. And he decided to make that payment so that you could be free. Now, again, if this is new to you, let me kind of illustrate it in another way for those of us who are visual learners. I came up with this little animation where, God is the righteous judge. He says, all stand. Right? And here I am. Eventually, I'll look like that guy right there. But right now, I'm standing there. He says, all rise. You're guilty because creation screams out the glory of God. Your conscience screams out the fact that you're guilty. And there's a whole bunch of people in the jury box over there who are like, get him, Paul, get him, Paul, get him, Paul. And then in Romans 2, Paul's like, what, hold on a second. You're guilty too. So all y'all Jews, Gentiles, really good, sort of everybody needs to get inside the dumpster and close the lid and think about your sin. And then when you appear before the judgment seat of the holy, righteous God, he looks at you and he says, you're guilty. That's Romans 3, 1 through 20. And then in his grace and in his mercy, he gets up from the seat, gets up from the judgment seat, and says, I'm going to take your place. And he went to the cross, setting us free. And it's even better than that. He sets us free and takes the chains off, takes us out of captivity, and then he clothes us in the righteousness of Christ. And I'm covered because of what he's done for me. If I could illustrate it like this, I went to Walmart yesterday and I could not find a white robe, so I had to grab the little children's ministry angel costume, but I need to get something that covers up these prison clothes, these old, dirty, rotten clothes, because Christ has clothed me in his righteousness. And I'm made righteous because the judge got down and looked at you and he looked at me and he said, you're not guilty. Not because you're righteous, but because my son is righteous. So Paul says, is there boasting? That's excluded. You can't boast about this. On what principle? On that of observing the law? Nope. It's on faith. For we maintain that a man is justified by faith. That's that great term, justification through faith alone, declared not guilty through faith alone, apart from observing the law. And here's the good news. This is legally, right? Legal is a big deal for God. Legally, I'm no longer under sin. I'm under grace. And legally, I got a new authority. I got a new master, and his name is Jesus Christ, because he, as Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 6, he bought me with a price. And sin is no longer my master. I got a new master because he gave me his everything. He bought me with everything that he had. There's a story about a little boy who is a woodworker, and he designs this little boat with his hands and paints it, and he looks at it and he says, wow, that's good. I'm proud of this creation. And he takes it over to the river, and he's playing with it, enjoying this new relationship with his boat. And as he's playing with it, a big wave comes and it knocks the boat out of his hands. And he's running down the river trying to get the boat and trying to reach in, but the boat ends up going off. And he's upset and sad and he doesn't know what he's going to do. And he goes to school. And a couple of days later, as he's on his way back from school, he looks in the window of a pawn shop and he sees his boat. And he's like, oh, there's my boat. There's my boat. So he goes inside and he says to the shop owner, hey, that's my boat. I made that boat. And the shop owner says, well, that's great, but you got to pay for it now. And he's like, okay. So he goes back home and he smashes his piggy bank and he takes all of his money and he goes back to the pawn shop and he lays it down on the counter and he says, I want my boat back. And the owner says, here you go. And he takes his boat and he goes outside and he's holding it in his arms and he says, you are mine little boat, once because I made you and twice because I bought you. And that's what your Heavenly Father has done for you. He made you, and then he bought you with everything that he had. That's why we talk about salvation so much around here. I like to say salvation, not education, is the solution to sin. Right? I mean, I love education, and I love teachers, and I love learning, and I love reading books. I love education, but it's only the salvation of Jesus Christ that can truly set me free. Let me illustrate this for you. So, again, I'll use examples from like 30 years ago or 20 years ago. I was in college, and before I was in college, just back up. So in high school, I graduated in 1996, and some of you remember the like no drugs campaign. Don't do drugs. This is your brain. This is your brain on drugs. And then they would have pictures of guys who had chewing tobacco addictions, and then like their jaw would fall off, and it was meant to scare you, right? So I was highly educated in the dangers of chewing tobacco. And then I went to Geneva College, and I played on a baseball team, and you were not allowed to chew on campus, and you certainly weren't allowed to chew on a baseball team. So one day, we had a game, and every game we had a doubleheader. So you play one, and then you play another one. Well, in the first game, I made an error that was so bad that coach benched me for the second game. And I'm sitting here on the bench, and I'll never forget this. And I am mad because the guy he put in front of me was not as righteous as I was. The guy he put in front of me, I thought was not as good as I was, and kind of did me wrong, and I'm sitting here in my dumpster of anger and just a mess, right? And then I looked on the end of the bench, and there's my buddy over here who's also on the bench. And because misery loves company, I didn't feel so bad. And then I look a little bit closer, and he's got a big wad of chew in his mouth. And I thought to myself, I remember seeing all those pictures where your jaw is going to fall off, and the school doesn't allow you to chew. So I went over to him, and I said, hey, can I get some of that chew? He's like, yes. So here I am. I am a rebel with a cause. And I'm like, Coach, I don't care if you see me. I don't care if everybody else sees me. I am righteously angry. You know why I was angry? Because my idol was performance on a baseball diamond, and he had blocked my idol, and I was mad. Now, the right thing to do in that moment, if I could rewind the tape, would be to say, okay, I'm upset that he took me out, but I'm not defined by my performance. I'm not defined with how well I perform. I'm defined by Christ. I got a new identity, and it is not in my performance. It is in Jesus Christ. I got a new master, and I can struggle with this a little bit, but at the end of the day, I got a brand new identity. I'm under the authority of Christ, and I don't have to go to idols to define me. That's the way I should have looked at it. You see, justification is a one-time event. Salvation is given to you at justification, but we need to work out our salvation with fear and trembling. Because some of you are like, okay, this is good, I appreciate this, but I still feel like I'm under sin at sometimes. I still feel angry and judgmental, and I still struggle with this whole thing called sin. And that's because we still think like we're under sin, and we still wrestle with this battle that we got called sin. But it's not education that's going to set you free. It's salvation. Douglas Moo, who wrote a commentary on Romans, said this: people by nature are addicted to sin. They are imprisoned under it, unable to free themselves by anything they can do. They are under arrest. Knowing this, then, God has sent to us not a teacher or a politician, but a liberator. One who has the power to set us free from our sins. See, I love the teachings of Jesus. He inspires me. But what I need most is the liberation of Jesus. To use another illustration, Abraham Lincoln's also one of my heroes, right? And he gave these amazing speeches, Gettysburg Address, second inaugural address. I get inspired. And if you're a black slave living in the 1860s, you're inspired by Abraham Lincoln, but none of those speeches did any good. Not even the Emancipation Proclamation. What they needed was the passage of the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which legally ended slavery. And understandably so, many of the slaves were set free, but they still thought like they were under slavery. See, what Jesus has done for you is he has given you legal status as a citizen of the King and cut you off from being under sin. So, this is why we talk about justification by faith so often. Because we need to bask in the fact and think about that amazing truth that legally and positionally, Christ has purchased me and justified me and made me new. Aren't you grateful for that? That's why we call it amazing grace. who saved a wretch like me. And that's what we're going to sing about in a moment. The fact that Christ has set you free. And you got to keep coming back. Come back next week. Keep wrestling through Romans with us because he deals with this whole, I'm set free and I'm a citizen of heaven, and yet I still struggle with sin. We're going to continue to talk about that. But for now, for today, let's enjoy being set free. Let's enjoy being justified. Let's enjoy his amazing grace. So take a moment and be silent before the Lord. Think about, maybe this is a moment where you could think about being in the dumpster of your own sin. And then as a church, we're going to stand together and sing about the amazing grace of Christ Jesus. So take a moment to silently confess your sin and pray to your God, and then we'll celebrate his amazing grace together.